Radicals in Conversation, the monthly podcast from Pluto Press, one of the world's leading independent radical publishers. I'm your host, Chris Browne. This month we bring you the final instalment in our three-part mini-series, Beyond the Ballot Box, which has explored some of the major political currents in US politics. Episode 1, featuring Mike Wendling, was recorded and released before the presidential election. Episode 2, with Peter Gelderloos and Vicky Osterweil, was released in late November. Today's episode we recorded on the 1st of May, and it goes without saying just how much has changed in the intervening months. It's a real honour to be joined on the podcast today by HLT Quan, Dylan Rodríguez, and my colleague James Kelly for a conversation about life in times of fascism. We explore concepts such as state addiction, anti-democracy, ungovernability, and democratic living. We also touch on the work of Cedric Robinson and what we can learn from Black abolition feminist praxis. HLT Quan's book, Become Ungovernable, an Abolition Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living, was published by Pluto Press in 2024. And as ever, podcast listeners can get 40% off the book on plutobooks.com. You just have to use the coupon podcast at the checkout. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Here are HLT Quan and Dylan Rodríguez on Radicals in Conversation. Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's episode. I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, James Kelly from Pluto Press, and we're also really excited to be on the call today with HLT Quan and Dylan Rodríguez. We've had this one in the works for a little while, so it's great that we're all sitting down in the same room. Well, we're not in the same room, but you know what I mean. We're making this happen. HLT Quan's the Pluto author, published Become Ungovernable, an Abolition Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living. I think that was back in February 2024. And listeners may recall we did an episode around the book back then with Barbara Ransbury and Tiffany Willoughby-Herrard. So I do encourage people to check that one out. But it's fair to say that a lot has happened in the 14 months since the book's publication. A lot has happened in the sort of couple of months since we first scheduled this recording as well. But the book definitely, I think, is a really vital resource and tool, kind of as we're at this present conjuncture. So before we dive into some of the ideas in the book and how they're relating to right now, it would be great if you could just maybe start by introducing yourselves for our listeners and for our viewers, and perhaps say a little bit about how you know one another as well, some of the ways in which your work is intertwined over the years. So maybe HQ will go to you first.
Thank you, Chris. And first, I want to thank Professor Dylan Rodríguez and James Kelly for being in conversation with me. There's never not a good time to be in conversation with folks. And in these terrible times, it's a privilege to be in conversation with you two. So thank you. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University in the School of Social Transformation. I teach justice and social inquiry. And Dylan, I'm very grateful to be a co-learner and fellow travelers on various paths to get free. I'm especially appreciative of Dylan's writing and work around carcerality on prison. And not just prison, but the ways in which prison govern us. And, the book, Become Ungovernable, is a lot about governing. And so prison as a regime of governing is an extraordinary thing that impacts every aspect of our lives. So I'm very grateful. I think I've known Dylan for quite a long time. I think almost 30 years, probably. I also just want to say very briefly that whatever we are experiencing today, it isn't the first time. And the many tools that we have in the past, we can continue to learn from and use. And someone like Dylan has a lot in his toolkit, both theoretical and practical. So again, I'm just so grateful to James and Dylan for being in conversation with me. I also want to say that at the onset that Become Ungovernable, or Against Tyranny, which is the working title of that manuscript, was a direct response to the gathering winds of unfreedom and censorship. Since the uptick of pro-Palestinian protests and criticism against the state of Israel in the last several years, there's also obviously a very concerted campaign against Black radical thought and Black radical praxis, particularly Black feminist radical praxis. I think that what we're seeing in policy, although whether or not they're legal, that's a whole different matter. What we're seeing in executive orders coming from this current administration, in many ways, a culmination of some of those activity. And so I think more than ever, we do need to pay attention to forces that are seeking to silence foreign policies, domestic policy, and mostly democratization forces, both in the United States and elsewhere. So that's part of what I want to look forward to in this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, HQ. And Dylan, how about yourself?
Sure. My name's Dylan Rodríguez. I work at University of California, Riverside in the Department of Black Study and the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. I was part of the Department of Ethnic Studies for a long time there. And I think the most relevant thing for this conversation is to just express the fact that I consider myself both simultaneously a student, a comrade, a co-conspirator, a fellow teacher, and a serious, deep friend and comrade of H.T. Quan. And I think this book is a gift. I want to say it's one of those manuscripts or texts or projects that's like a kind of a reflection of life work, but I just don't doubt that HQ is going to keep going and do something else like this in a couple years. So I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say this is just another massive contribution that my dear comrade and friend is making to praxis and thought, trying to advance all of us toward liberationist, abolitionist, and perhaps revolutionary horizons that are, I think, within grasp and imminent and all around us. So when I say horizons, I'm not thinking about something that's far away and postponed. I'm thinking alongside this book, which understands horizons as something which is simultaneously both, right? It's simultaneously both, something that you imagine over there, far away, another time, another place, but is also right next to you and maybe on you already. So this book twists your mind like that. In my relationship and ongoing dialogues with HQ have done that for me for many years. And so we've known each other in so many different ways. And so I'm just really happy to be in this conversation for other folks to hear us think with each other and think alongside y'all too. So thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate being part of this.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Dylan. So, I mean, I guess I'll just quote from your book briefly, HQ. In the introduction, I think you write how the book seeks to make two related arguments. Firstly, that ungovernability is an important theoretical space for thinking about resistance and mobilization. And second, that resisting anti-democracy in these proto-fascist times requires a democratic toolkit that takes stock of ungovernable happenstance wherever it might be. So I guess contained within this sort of passage, there's at least two concepts there that I think it's worth sort of drawing out, and which I guess will be a thread throughout our conversation today. So ungovernability, firstly, and anti-democracy as well. Perhaps we could turn first to anti-democracy, because that might be, talking about proto-fascist times. There's a lot of kind of articles you see penned in, I guess, mainstream outlets kind of talking about the need to defend American democracy right now. And actually, I guess what the book is arguing is that we can't really describe it as a democracy. But anyway, I'd love to hear more about this idea of anti-democracy as you interpret it.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. And I think you and Dylan, I think, know this very well, that my work extends Cedric Robinson's work, who in many ways in his entire oeuvre has sought to delineate the many ways in which Western political theory has governed us, has limited our understanding, and in some way our ontological sort of predisposition against democracy. And so he used the term anti-democracy in some of his work, particularly work with classical theory, to show how there's a long genealogy in Western thought that are actually martial intellectual energy against the idea of many people rule, right? We understand democracy as the rule by the people. But in reality, all of these political, intellectual thought has been really to devote to rule governing by a few people, by the elite, by the expert technologists, or by the wealthy. It's rarely ever that we believe or work toward, that is, in terms of mainstream theorizing, toward a situation in which the people actually rule. And so that's Robinson's main argument. So what I hope to do in this work was to really show how in the United States we were actually democracy that is ruled by the many, or just living in democratic relationship, actually is an unthought. It's something that we're not allowed to think about as we theorize what is the best way we organize ourselves as a society. And so anti-democracy show up when Madison writes about the need for factions and that the elite will rule. Anti-democracy show up when Jefferson believed that Black people are not capable of ruling themselves, right? Anti-democracy show up when we are told that prisoners have no right to vote, or women should not think about policy, should not be in the policy-making arena. Does that make sense? So what I thought we should do is, as a form of governing, we have only understood democracy as ruled by a few people who have been deemed as fit to rule. So anti-democracy show up too in the form of periodic elections, where in the West, that's in Israel, that's in Germany, that's in England, that's in the United States, where largely the wealthy people dictate who will run, who is capable of running, who should be our candidate, and so on and so forth. And then that also includes the type of policies that we are allowed to think about. And so I thought that in the book, what we should do is not only delineate how we have come to live with anti-democracy, but how ordinary people from all over and from different time and context actually have tried democratic living, right? Have tried to not be a subject of anti-democracy, but outside of it. And that's when Become Ungovernable comes in. So people fought against tyranny, big and small tyranny, at every turn. And that's the thing. We don't know quite why people always resist, but we do know that if there's domination, if there's oppression, it is very likely that there will be resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that leads quite nicely onto the second term that I mentioned, which is ungovernability, which, could you say, I admit, asking you to say, what's ungovernability? That might seem like I'm asking you to give a thesis to the whole book in a short answer.
I won't.
But
I promise I won't. And I'll try to be actually very brief, because I'm dying to hear what Dylan and James has to say. So ungovernability as a theoretical construct is one of those unthinkable in mainstream political thought. We are told by very respected political theorists that ungovernable is a nonsensical term, right? Because as one famous political theorist said, it is not whether or not we will be governed, is how we will be governed. And I just thought, that is so bizarre, because throughout history, people have done many things to resist structures of governing. So someone like Dylan is telling us abolition is a praxis, it's a way of life. So how do we then consider that the question isn't about whether or not we will be governed, but that's not true, because if that's true, we could never even imagine abolition. Slaves would always assume that slavery is the thing and not an inhuman as a negation, as a dehumanization process. And so that's Become Ungovernable is an attempt to reclaim ourselves away from something that's actually alien, that is governing. All state-making effort is actually not a natural thing. And so I wanted people to consider the possibility of not, however temporarily, not being governed by racism, by white supremacy, by carcerality, by racial capitalism. Does that make sense? Because we have ample historical, empirical evidence that people have done so. Because if people haven't, we would never have this plethora of instances where people just do things because it's right, people do things because it's just, people do things because it's moral, not for profit, not for governing, not so that they can be on top.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I guess as I say, things have kind of moved at a real pace, but it feels like, the book was written sort of after the year of uprisings, 2020 with Black Lives Matter. And that feels like a moment, albeit a moment that emerged from a more enduring movement in which people demonstrated this kind of refusal to be governed. So another idea, which I think maybe Dylan speaks about, is this idea of liberal counterinsurgency. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to what's happened in the wake of these uprisings, and would we describe what happened in the years following 2020 as a sort of liberal counterinsurgency, with attempts to neutralize the more radical ambitions of the movement, funneling people back towards the state? And then do we think that we're still witnessing this kind of liberal counterinsurgency, if that is what it is, now, or have the kind of unprecedented attacks on, diversity, equality, and inclusion coming from the Trump administration? Is this a rupture from that? So yeah, I'd just be interested to hear a little bit more of this kind of the last 5 years, if you will.
Okay, so I really want Dylan to answer this. So I hope this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then Dylan gets to actually push back or push forward. I actually think that, and again, this is my in some way, I'm a student of Robinson's explanation of order and authority. I think that we tend to extend tremendous courtesy, gravitas toward leadership and authority in a way that's unwarranted, that is governing. It always achieves a certain kind of moral and authority, intellectual authority that not always warranted. And what I mean by that is that the same way that I think that the Republican Party, for instance, thought that it had control over Trump, the candidate, in 2015 and 2016, the Republican establishment, and it didn't, right? Similarly, I think that the Democratic establishment imagined itself as being in control of, or even the leadership imagined itself being in control of grassroots radical insurrection. So there are two things that we need to understand about movements for Black Lives and even Black Lives Matter movement. And that is to say, there are the real radical articulation of how we need to reimagine life in the late 20th and 21st century. And it has tremendous impact. And it impacts everything from art to policy. Yes? The way in which we no longer take for granted that the state and the police have a monopoly on our safety and security. In fact, they are the source of our insecurity and unsafety and harm. That part, I think that's the radical impulse. That's the thing that it's going to be really difficult to govern. That's the ungovernable part of that movement, right? And there are folks who are doing this work on the ground, and they continue to do this work regardless of who occupies the White House. And then the counterinsurgency is always working because that's what we know about liberalism. That's what we know very well about gendered racial capitalism, because it has the capacity to renovate itself. So today we might call it techno-autocracy. Tomorrow we might call it something else. But the reality is that it will constantly renovate itself because its desire is to govern the very impulse of the people who don't want to be governed. So I'll leave it at that. I would, if you look at the most recent election in the United States, as I have taken to explain to some, been trying to convince some of my friends who need very little convincing, by the way, is that, we used to think that, the billionaires, they hide their footprint and they hide their fingerprint and they stay behind and they let their helpers do the work of policy. Well, in this last election, it was not an exaggeration to say that even the billionaires no longer trust the millionaires to run the show for them. They're taking over. So they're going to keep changing, and they're going to think that they can govern everyone from the millionaires all the way on down to the people who can barely afford food, the people who experience food insecurity. But people are not taking this down. I mean, I think that you see resistance at every level. Including people within the Federalist Society. Whether or not that's that is part of the counterinsurgency, I think a large part is. But I think that if we continue to rely on the state and the policy elite to tell us what we need to do, that's where we strengthen the counterinsurgency.
I can jump in here for a moment, and I'm gonna do what students do, which is I'm gonna take one of my choice favorite passages from the book as my point of departure for a couple comments, a couple thoughts that I'll share. This is from page 21. Quote, "I view democracy as fundamentally anarchic, full of risks, and potentially potent. In contradistinction to the Western variety of anarchism, which I take HQ as white anarchism, more or less. Democratic anarchism is a social philosophy that as a starting point embodies the aspirations of the masses, rejects order as alien, irrational, and unnatural, and conspires in solidarity to bring about justice as compassion." This is one of the moments in the book that I think absolutely demystifies what you periodize as the last 5 years, by way of understanding that the last 5 years are, in most ways, not necessarily singular or unique, as much as the narcissism of our biographies makes us believe it is. There is a continuity. There's a continuity. There are waves of resistance, repression, and then reaccommodation and then restoration of existing orders. This is part of the civilizational project. This is part of the kind of civilizational project of governing against the form of fundamentally anarchic democracy and life being that HQ is talking about. So there's a rejection of order that happens constantly. I mean, there's this concept I've been thinking about, in part inspired by, I think probably centrally inspired by this book, over the last period of time, that I've been positing as the always existing disruption and confounding of all forms of counterinsurgency, liberal and otherwise. And that's the idea that there is always and already an insurgent totality, right? And this is also inspired by Cedric Robinson's notion coming from the Black radical tradition, of an ontological totality. So I'm thinking about this a little bit differently, but it's inspired by both HQ and Cedric Robinson, appropriately enough, right? To think about insurgency, that is the disruption of the forms of governance that want to neutralize the fundamentally anarchic praxis of democracy in all of its forms, right? In all, it's democracy with a small d. This is crucial, right? When we read this book, it's democracy with a small d, which means it's a proliferating, anti-paradigmatic concept of anarchy. It is, as HQ puts it is fundamentally anarchic. I mean, what does it mean to take that seriously as the primary capaciousness, the primary proliferation, the promiscuity through which to understand what HQ names as democratic living? So when we think about these last 5 years, I think what it does help us understand is that we need to define our terms really well. That when we talk about counterinsurgency, we need to understand counterinsurgency is a very particular kind of warfare. And it's oftentimes misinterpreted, or it's kind of narrowed down to mean that it is warfare generally waged by the state to destroy radical movements, right? Of course, it's significantly that. The history of counterinsurgency is significantly that. But if we're going to be serious about specifying and being focused and rigorous about how we understand this thing we're calling counterinsurgency, it's not merely that. In fact, it's arguably not primarily that, right? Destroying revolutionary movements, you could just call that warfare. You could just call that colonialism. You could just call that plantation war, right? Anti-Black plantation war. Counterinsurgency is war that is waged over the legitimacy of an existing order of power. It's about legitimacy. So counterinsurgency, if we understand it as war waged over the legitimacy of a specific order of power, usually state power, then the other thing we need to understand about what you introduced in your question as the concept of liberal counterinsurgency is that liberal counterinsurgency, then we need to understand that deeply as well. We need to understand that as something that accompanies the fundamentally anarchic praxis of democracy, right? Liberal counterinsurgency is not necessarily imposed from external institutions and actors onto radical movements, right? It's not necessarily the Democratic Party or liberal social justice branded nonprofits that are imposing liberal counterinsurgency on grassroots, street-based, or organized or semi-organized or intentionally, multiply, seemingly disorganized insurrections against an existing order. The problem of liberal counterinsurgency is that it can actually be an internal tendency within a movement, within an insurrection. Liberal counterinsurgency can be an embedded political and ideological paradigm that people carry with them, in which they will act out to neutralize their own disruptive possibilities, their own insurrectionist possibilities, in other words, to internally impose order onto that fundamentally anarchic way of being. And that I think is the danger of understanding just how present the logics of counterinsurgency are, liberal and otherwise, right? That they're not necessarily imposed from an external force or a military or an external state. That this is part of what organizers, activists, scholars, even revolutionaries and abolitionists, we carry this shit with us. So part of what we fight all the time is that we fight against the own counterinsurgency tendencies that we carry with us. I do it every day and I fail all the time, but at least I'm talking about it. So now you can hold me to it, but this is what the book does.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dylan. I think this is why it's so important that it is in these times, in the time that even not just us, but all kind of people are calling these times fascists or proto-fascists if they don't want to sound too radical. But it is especially in fascist context where we have to be intentional and be more acutely aware of the spaces of counterinsurgency and the participant of counterinsurgency, which Dylan is pointing to. Because that's part of what state addiction means. That's part of what being addicted to governability means. It means that we actually internalize the terms of order. That's what Robinson explained, right? So that the minute in which we begin to censor ourselves. So this is why scholar of fascist thought tells you don't obey in advance. But for counterinsurgency to work, it isn't just the external force. It is the internal obeying that makes it effective. Does that make sense? So we believe that we need rules. We believe that the only way that resistance can be legitimate is nonviolence. That we believe that no one has the right to defend itself except for the state. That's the ideology that governs all of us in these current moment. And so we have to be very self-reflective, which I think feminist labor can be extraordinarily helpful there. But being reflective and being accountable to our own participation in this process is something that, this is why I read Dylan's work. It is because we can never be acutely aware enough of these conditions. I mean, Fanon writes about internalized oppression and the roles that various classes play. So he's more categorical about these things. But I think part of learning from the last 30, 40 years of scholarship, particularly in radical critical theory, is that we are a little bit more capacious in our way of thinking the different sources of how we are governed and how we become ungoverned.
Dylan, I've got a question for you. Your work has called out the dangers of reformism. Looking at the present, much of the mainstream resistance to Trump's return is once again rallied around faith in institutions. stability of the markets, integrity of the courts, the supposed resilience of liberal democracy, rather than confronting those deeper structures that enabled the rise of the MAGA movement in the first place. What do you think's being missed in this approach, and how do you think it might actually reinforce the very anti-democratic foundations it claims to oppose?
Yeah, what's happening now is something way worse than reform or reformism. This is something that I would call, okay, on the one hand, we can probably easily identify how the current moment is a period of liberal reaction, right? We see it everywhere, and we see it distressingly among people who would otherwise identify themselves politically as something left of liberal, right? Many of people that are engaged in full liberal reaction, by which I mean assertions of things that reinforce the legitimacy of a liberal state concept, right? So things like, for example, academic freedom, freedom of speech, civil rights generally, the integrity of electoral politics, the need for relative autonomy of public research institutions like universities, or K through 12 schools, et cetera. So there's a kind of there's a reaction against the overt authoritarian attacks on the ideal concept of a liberal civil society. So this is a liberal reaction. That's what I mean by this, right? But I think it's much deeper than that. I think that we can actually categorize this as something that is significantly different, probably qualitatively different from what you would traditionally call reformism, because what we're actually experiencing is the articulation of what I would call reactionary liberalism, right? And I mean reactionary liberalism in the sense that this is, first of all, it's a fiction, right? Liberalism is a fiction, first and foremost. We need to understand this, right? As with most political narratives and political concepts, it's a fiction, and it doesn't make it any less material or deadly than warfare is, right? Like war is waged over fictions and narratives. So what I'm calling out right now as a reactionary liberalism is, the reason I'm saying it's reactionary is that it's guided by this delusional fantasy of fulfilling some kind of liberal institutional dream in which things like the electoral political apparatus, universities, K through 12 schools, and so-called civil society somehow live up to the ideal understanding of the way in which they are supposed to function in a so-called free, so-called democratic society, which they never fucking have, right? All those institutions have always been actively mobilized, and its planners have been active participants in various forms of irregular, asymmetric warfare against specific targeted populations in whatever nation state formation they're part of, especially the United States, right? This is not unique to the United States, but I would say it's especially the case in the United States. So it's a reactionary liberalism in that sense, right? It seeks to reinstall or vindicate or defend a form of liberalism, which is actually a fiction that wages war on specific people. Like, that's the point, right? This is not democracy, right? This is a reactionary liberalism. And this is what is so distressing about it. Like, I mean, HQ and I work at the university. We both work in public universities. We're surrounded by this bullshit right now, right? We're surrounded by colleagues, from various disciplines, from the sciences to the humanities to the arts, that are celebrating a kind of coalitional moment in which they tend to agree on the idea that the primary mission right now is to defend and rescue the idea of the liberal, open, free-thinking research institution from the attacks of an authoritarian state, right? And of course, what it leaves aside completely, what it conveniently ignores, is how the normative state of all of those institutions has always and already been guided by really institutional principles that reproduce the very colonial, anti-Black, misogynist, it's like Islamophobic. Those are the logic that actually constitute these institutions in their normative liberal state. So that's the period we're in. I think it's actually much worse than reformism. And the problem, of course, is that these kind of the ebb and flow of these political moments is something that we sometimes lose track of. I mean, there is something that we need to anticipate, right? Which is that this particular wave of authoritarian fascism will eventually ebb and seed to a liberal, neoliberal, multiculturalist iteration of advanced fascism, which we've already kind of experienced in different ways over the last 20 years, right? And the problem is that people will be celebrating that, right? I'm talking about the people that I'm kind of inferring from the previous part of my comments here, right? Like the people people that we are surrounded by will be celebrating the return of an advanced liberal multiculturalist, version of fascism. So this is the problem. And none of that has anything to do with democratic living, right? With the fundamentally anarchic praxis of democratic living. It is the neutralization of all of that. And so that's what we are fighting.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I really take pain in the book to try to show and demonstrate is that despite these larger kind of mobilization that Dylan referred to, for instance, people, so this is why we have to take cues not from the forces that would celebrate a less harmful fascism, a more humane fascism, if you will, rather than look to them for leadership or for cues. We need to be looking to the people and in the community. So in the book, I try to take pain to show the many ways. In fact, there are quite a few ways in which people do this every day, and they don't get celebrated. Because they are not in a position to do so, or some people intentionally don't want you to know. Because the moment in which it's legible to the state, it might then warrant a certain kind of swift retaliation that they may not have the resources to counter. So that's the other thing we need to understand, and I think it's important that we don't mistake silences with absences, right? That is to say that, yes, you do see demonstration of legitimate, acceptable, friendly resistance, if you will, or what Dylan called reactionary liberalism. But there are other things that people are doing. So I think it's a mistake to think that it's an either or. What Dylan is framing is an either or, because I know in his own work and in the work that people I encounter, they do different things, right? So I'm working on a documentary about borders justice and about some of the folks who are doing this and who started some of the sanctuary movement in the country in Tucson. Many years ago. But one of the person I interviewed several weeks ago, actually 2 weeks ago, just as part of a conversation, what do we do now? And she didn't say any specific about what we need to do to counter ICE and so on and so forth. She says radical hospitality, and I said, what is radical hospitality? She said, magic. And that's the thing that we never allow in so-called civil discourse, in public discourse about borders, or about ICE, or about deportation, or about life living in a fascist state. We're not allowed to talk about magic. We're not allowed to talk about radical hospitality. We'll talk about whatever that we think will get will be accepted as legitimate. Does that make sense? So there are certain kind of labor that is being performed. I give the example, for instance, about women of color organizing for reproductive justice in the book, where it isn't just mass action, isn't just direct mobilization, although they did that, but they also reframe the meanings of justice. Also, they distribute information. So the state is really, in many ways, this is one of the most articulated moments in which the state essentially announces itself as we're not going to give any pretense that we care about people's welfare. We don't care about people's livability. We care about security for the state, its own survivability, and we care about making money for ourselves. Right? It's in an incredibly it's very clear. The clarity of this administration is actually in some way a relief. And so what that means is that there are people at every level, in small town, big town, they are providing direct service. Not just rapid response, but direct service. And they are redefining well-being and social welfare in ways that we have not allowed that discourse to emerge because we have become so addicted to the monopoly of the state. And so I think that's the cost of, what do you call it, Dylan? Reactionary liberalism.
How do you think we end that addiction to the state that you mentioned?
Well, you know how I don't believe in the 12-step.
Yeah. No, we don't
I
have
don't
a
think there are
choice.
12 steps, but we have to. We have
Yeah.
to end that addiction. Sometimes it is a slow, gradual process because some of us are depending on our proximity to being vulnerable and being harmed. So it's a gradual process. But we know that the harm reduction process in chemical addiction doesn't really work because it doesn't really look at the cause of harm. It merely tries to put a bandage on it. I know that because my students do critical drug studies. So I'm learning from that. So I know that the state addiction is something we have to pay attention to and we have to end, because so long as it has a monopoly on telling us how to solve our problems, because it causes our problem, many of them, not all, but some, and if so long as it monopolizes all the thinkable of all the solutions, we are not helping ourselves. Because the state is not interested in the livability of its people. As like I said, this administration, there's a stark relief in terms of how it presents itself. So if it doesn't care about our well-being, then we can't rely on it for solution for our well-being.
I think part of the answer to your question as well is, in terms of, by the way, I appreciate the way you put it, because I think addiction is an important way to understand. I think that there is like a kind of like a neurochemical response that people have. I'm talking about my people, like the people who I'm in community with, I'm in collectives and organizations and so forth with. I think that many of us have an actual neurochemical response to a notion of the state to the notion of state power as a site of solution, as a site of what we generally will call sustainable infrastructure, as a site of care and security and so forth, right? That I think addiction is in some ways a really appropriate term. So in some ways, I think the question is not necessarily how to end the addiction, but rather how to understand that the thing to which we are addicted, like number one, in the sense in which we imagine it really has never existed, right? Like there's various forms of care and infrastructure that have existed that are radical, that are revolutionary, that are caring, that are abolitionist, that are fugitive, that are anti-colonial. And they have very little to do with the notion of a modern state. So that's one. Secondly, the actually existing state that is around us in many places, including and especially in North America, is collapsing, right? Like the legitimacy of the state certainly is experimenting with its own implosion, right? The current moment is exactly that. This is an experiment in how to rule, how to govern in the absence of state legitimacy. And in fact, while actively trying to undermine or implode all of both the superficial and deep institutional edifices that reproduce state legitimacy. So what does it mean? What does it mean to govern in the United States when the state is actually illegitimate, when state power is illegitimate for a significant proportion of the people who are there? And what does it mean to win people over in that kind of moment? And then in a material sense, the actual infrastructures of the state are deeply non-functional. Dysfunctional is the wrong term. They're actually non-functional. I live in California, right, where the state is directly responsible for shit constantly being on fucking fire, right? Like, and there's nothing that can stop that. Like, it's not the Colorado River access that's going to stop it. There's nothing to stop it, because in the middle of climate collapse, in the middle of a state infrastructure that has literally turned the state, significant parts of the state, into a fucking tinderbox, right? This is what we mean when we talk about both an implosion of legitimacy, but also an implosion of the state apparatus and state rule and state infrastructure itself. It is actually destroying itself. It is destroying us. So I think part of this notion of addiction is also about what does it mean when the actual thing you're addicted to in your fantasy, it's never materially existed, and in its material existence is collapsing, right? That's the question, is how to recognize the collapse and how to live and deal and engage politically and collectively and lovingly within an already happening collapse. That's not a fantasy. That's already around. So I think a lot of us are in denial about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that maybe emerges in the book, which I'd written down kind of in response to that, is around this idea of safety and security, which too often is tied to an idea of like national security and a security in that sort of exclusionary sense or whatever. So I think in the book, HQ, you say how seeded and fertilized by the radical tradition of Black feminist praxis, abolition feminism centers on justice, dignity, and livability by redefining safety and security as it retools the praxis of solidarity for mass mobilization. So, yeah, I mean, given that, I guess, feelings of insecurity surely underpin the support for fascism, it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about how we can reimagine this idea of safety and security away from these flawed notions of national security.
So Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie wrote this wonderful book called Abolition Feminism Now. And I think, is there an exclamation after now? I don't remember, but it should be. If it isn't, it should be. Because I feel as if, and as I said earlier, I think part of the attempt to govern and to censor the critical thought that occur as a result of a general awakening about white supremacy, about capitalism, about police violence, is, or just policing, because policing is violence, precisely because abolition feminists force us to rethink some very fundamental, basic ideas about living in community with others, right? If we imagine people to be fellow travelers, if we imagine that there's a world where many world fits, as the Zapatista imagine it, then we don't need the kind of empty promise, which may be completely empty promise if Dylan is right. And there's no reason to believe that Dylan is wrong, because there's evidence, there's empirical evidence that shows that the state has not, in fact, provided whatever promises of security and safety to the majority of the people ever, right? And so what that means is that we need to really have to take stock of our relationship, including our friends, including our neighbors, including the people we don't know anything about. How do we think about our well-being in relation to other human beings, but also other species? So planetary wellness, for instance, is a different kind of concept. It's not security. It focuses on the well-being of all agents and participants on this planet. That's a radically different way of thinking, a different ontological approach to living. And I think that democratic living, yeah, we are always going to be, it's risky because you're trusting the people as opposed to a few elite. But seriously, we have tried elite rule for a very long time. You know, maybe we should try something maybe a little risky. But I think fascism is very risky. The only predictable thing about fascism is harm, right? So we're gonna trust our neighbor. We're gonna trust total strangers. We're gonna trust the people in Thailand, and we're gonna trust people in China, and we're gonna trust people in North America. I don't know what's going to happen, but what I do know is that when people are left to their own devices, without the intrusion of the police, without the intrusion of the court, without the intrusion of the state, they actually do better.
If I can just add to this, right? Part of the context in which we think about this question, which is the question is something along the lines of, what the fuck are we going to do? Okay, like that's kind of what we're asking ourselves. Okay, like given what we understand the theater of the state to be occupied by, like the kind of actors and institutions that is occupied by, and the kind of bullshit that we are being inundated with to try to reinvite our engagement and our relegitimation of the state as an entity and the state as the primary apparatus through which we seek security, safety, sustainability, and even community sometimes, right? Given that, what do we do? Well, I think part of the context for thinking about this question is to understand that, we're living in a historical moment in which everything that happens next will demonstrate to us that the institutions that we are accustomed to kind of moving within and through will never be the same, right? And this in some ways, this started in 2020 with the global insurgencies against anti-Black state power. In other ways, it further intensified in October 2023 through the present, with the global and diasporic war on Palestinian existence, right? The ongoing Nakba of almost now an ongoing. We're into like approaching the first century of this ongoing Nakba, and thinking about how all of these moments of both rebellion and intensified genocidal activity indicate that we're probably inhabiting a historical period in which the aftermath will have permanent and indelible implications for how we think about politics, how institutions work, and which force redefinitions of our keywords like security and community and sustainability and safety, and even the idea of life and thriving. Like, none of this shit will be the same. I mean, even the places we work, to bring it down in a really concrete way, the places that we are employed in, right? Universities, I'm telling you right now, it's already not the same, right? But as this particular wave of authoritarian attack on universities, as it ebbs and flows, as a version of a kind of liberal, neoliberal, so-called fascist normality, it, returns in some way in the coming period, right? These institutions will never be the same. They will never be what they were 5 years ago, much less 10 or 15 years ago. The question is in part a question of praxis, which leads me back to the importance and the contributions of HQ's book. Okay, because what this book shows us is how the work of archive is an activity. The work of archive is a collective activity. And not only that, the work of archive is a collective activity that is present and central to all radical, revolutionary, liberationist, and collective, anarchically democratic activity. That work of doing archive is crucial to all of it, because what it helps us understand, number one, it gives us tools for the kind of analysis that will allow us to comprehend what is actually happening in real time. That's the point of archive, right? That's the point of the kind of archive that HQ's book is doing, right? And secondly, in addition to the analysis, it actually gives us examples, right? Actually existing and whether contemporaneous or whether through kind of historical reflection, actual examples of how to live, how to commune, and how to be collectively in the direct context of collapse, of indelible and irreformable changes to the institutions that we are accustomed to just inhabiting in some kind of state of normalcy. When that's gone, which is what we are in now, that's gone, right? So that makes the work of archive and thinking collectively about the existing archive of democratic living, of abolition, liberationist praxis, that much more crucial. That's the work.
HQ, you've written about ungovernability as a vital theoretical space, not chaos for its own sake, but a principled sort of refusal of anti-democratic governance. How do you see this idea? We've mentioned a few here, but how do you see this idea being practiced in today's movements, from student occupations and encampments to prison strikes? And how can we protect these spaces from being neutralized or absorbed into the systems they oppose?
I think that part of that acute awareness, the self-reflection that Dylan was talking earlier about, the many ways in which we ourselves are sort of our own wardens, right? I think that that's an important, part of the praxis. And this is why I think feminist labor is important, because feminist scholars are very good and feminist activists are very good about pointing out how we need to be accountable within our own positionality and so on and so forth. I think that we need to recognize that we don't have all the solutions. I mean, it's a really bizarre idea that despite the planet being this old and as many humans and other species as there are on the planet, that somehow we monopolize the solutions. I mean, that's an incredibly arrogant notion. I think I comment on the discovery logic, right, which is fundamentally colonial. The idea that we discover new ideas. I don't think that we do. I think archiving is an important technique to learn new things. I also think that we need to pay attention. And in this way, I'm really old school, right? I think we need to pay attention to young people. In part, precisely because they don't have as much experience in self-censorship, because they haven't lived that long. They haven't been governed that long. And so I think they can be a guide in creating spaces and maintaining autonomous spaces. I think we learn things by taking risk and allowing just kind of like step back a little bit and because that's what democratic living is. It isn't about hierarchy. It isn't about control. It isn't about governing. It isn't about rules. And it means risk-taking, and it means learning from past experiences. Queer theory are fantastic about the art of failing. Actually, that's the name of the book. The art of failure. We need to fail. The state obviously need to fail, but so do we. And I think we can learn from failing. If you would indulge me, I know we're running out of time, but since we're recording on May Day, I want to acknowledge today is International Labor's Day. And Eduardo Galeano has this wonderful book called Children of the Days. And every day there's a little wisdom. And I want to read you something, James, since you brought this up. So I blame you. Okay, so this is on International Workers' Day. He said, the technology of shared flight. The first goose to take off opened the ways for the next, who clears the path for the third, and the strength of the third raises the fourth, who then helps the fifth, and the impulse of the fifth pulls along the sixth, who offers wind to the seventh. When the lead goose tires, he goes to the back of the line and leaves his spot to another, who moves to the apex of the V. The geese form in the air. Each takes a turn forward and back, and none of them believes he is super goose because he flies first, or that flying last make him a loser. I think part of planetary justice is to recognize that we can find wisdom in every species, and just that teach me a lot about how we may cope in these stressful times.
I think that's a really nice place to leave it, unless anyone has anything that they'd like to add.
I want to affirm what HQ just said. And I want to say that in addition to listening to young folks, which I can talk about now because I've hit my 50s now. So I'm feeling that. I will also add that listening to younger folks not only does not absolve us of this responsibility, but actually accentuates and emphasizes it. There's a responsibility for those of us who are not young folks to very intentionally and critically share wisdom, right? Of certainly wisdom about failures and wisdom about, what we want to maybe call victories and successes, but wisdom that is a wisdom that can only emerge through collective praxis. So I'm not talking about a kind of traditionally academic notion of wisdom here. I'm talking about wisdom that comes from shared praxis, from the messiness, from what HQ just identified as failure. I don't really use the terms of failure that much, because I use the terms of experimentation instead, right? So like the wisdom that comes from shared and collective experimentation. And people who are engaged rigorously in experimentation, they don't necessarily talk about failure. They talk about doing shit over again, right? They expect experiments are not about like it working the first or 100th time. It's like figuring it out and sharing the wisdom collectively that comes from, and that's praxis, right? The thing I'm calling experimentation, that is praxis. So I think there's an obligation, a responsibility around the sharing of critical wisdom, that emerges through shared praxis. And that is what my dear comrade H.T. Quan calls democratic living.
Well, I mean, just to reiterate once again, the book Become Ungovernable, An Abolition, Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living, it is obviously available now from Pluto Press. It's on plutobooks.com and available through all good retailers as well. So I do encourage people to check that out and get stuck in, because obviously this conversation we've had today is just a taster of the book, really. And but I hope people have enjoyed watching, listening, wherever they've been, consuming this podcast. All that remains is to thank my colleague James once again, Dylan Rodríguez, and HLT Quan for this really excellent conversation. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate you both. Thank you.
That was HLT Quan and Dylan Rodríguez on Radicals in Conversation. Once again, Become Ungovernable, An Abolition Feminist Ethic for Democratic Living is out now and available to buy on plutobooks.com. Podcast listeners can get 40% off the book using the coupon podcast at the checkout. If you enjoy the show, then please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And of course, you can find the audio version of this podcast on all the major platforms as well. We'll be back in a few weeks' time with our next episode. So until then, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.